In 1942, during the height of the Second World War, a test pilot was seriously injured flying one of the most remarkable and, for the pilot, dangerous aircraft of the era, the rocket-powered Messerschmitt 163. Injury, or even death, have never been an uncommon occurrence during test flying. What was remarkable in this case was that the test pilot was a woman, the amazing Hanna Reitsch. Hanna Reitsch was born in eastern Germany in 1912, the second of 3 children, the daughter of a respected eye specialist. Flying replaced early ambitions to become a missionary doctor, and by her early 20s she had broken numerous world gliding records, been a stunt pilot in a feature film, and was eventually testing experimental gliders. In 1936, schoolboy Eric Brown accompanied his father, a veteran aviator of World War I, to the Berlin Olympics. They had been invited by Luftwaffe General Ernst Udet to see a display of glider flying. It was here that for the first time Eric Brown met Hanna Reitsch.
She was a very small, very petite lady, not particularly good-looking, but very effervescent. I got the impression, in fact, that she was more than effervescent, she was highly strung and a compulsive talker. She was trying to battle with her very fractured English, and Udet's English was very poor as well. So it wasn't the ideal way to get a first impression of her. But I did get this definite impression that she was hyperactive.
Under the patronage of Udet, Hanna Reitsch was given the title of Flugkapitän, flight captain, a title she was in no way qualified for, and appointed a test pilot at the German Aircraft Development Centre at Rechlin, the German Farnborough. One of her first tasks was testing the notorious Stuka dive bomber.
The men were on the military test place didn't like at first that a girl were flying there because it was a man's job at this time. But when they saw that I silently in one corner where I thought nobody would see it made, every day from very great height, my vertical dives with bombers and Stukas and so on, to test air brakes from all different military types.
By 1938, Eric Brown had become a language student and was studying in Nazi Germany. He saw Udet and Hanna regularly and observed a mutually beneficial relationship. For the publicity-seeking Udet, the benefits were obvious.
It was in that publicity role, I'm afraid, that Udet began to use her significantly. But I formed the opinion at that time that I thought she was rather manipulative. And she knew that if she really worked on Udet, she could twist him round her little finger, really. And she was absolutely tenacious in what she wanted. Very ambitious. And what she wanted was obviously to expand her flying activities. And with his help, of course, she could do that.
Udet soon saw a golden opportunity to use his protégé to great effect in publicising Germany's pioneering helicopter research. Hanna Reitsch had already been successfully test flying the Focke-Wulf 61 helicopter, when Udet proposed a novel way to reveal it to the world at large, by displaying it inside Berlin's Deutschlandhalle during the 1938 Motor Show.
1938, he thought, we will show the helicopter, and Hanna had to demonstrate this.
For 2 weeks, Hanna's spectacular and potentially dangerous display was the highlight of the show, every night culminating with a Nazi salute prior to landing.
But all went well, and it was so clever of General Udet because due to this, it remained an historical fact that Professor Focke's helicopter was really the very first in the history of mankind.
12 months later, Germany's mastery of aviation technology was being used to devastating effect as Adolf Hitler began his invasion of Europe. Assault gliders, which Hanna had assisted in the development of, were used to great effect when German assault troops captured the Belgian fort of Ibn Emal. The success of the Ibn Emal raid prompted the German High Command to consider the use of gliders in the proposed invasion of Britain. But they were looking for something on a much larger scale than the troop-carrying gliders that had been used before. The Messerschmitt Gigant remained the largest, heaviest glider ever to fly until the testing of the American Space Shuttle in the 1970s. It was so heavy that it required 3 Me-110 fighter bombers and rocket boosters to get it airborne.
It was so primitively built that it was so difficult to fly. You needed so much strength. And you see, this, what is too hard for me in a 5 minutes flight, that is too hard for a strong man in a 1 hour flight. So I tried with this argument to convince Udet to stop it, but he didn't believe it, because Messerschmitt said, she is too small a little girl, but not a strong man.
Hanna's lack of physical strength almost proved to be disastrous on her first flight of the Gigant, when test pilot Karl Franke had to rush into the cockpit to help her regain control of the aircraft. Ultimately, Hanna's reservations about the Gigant were proven to be justified. One fatal accident cost the lives of 129 personnel, and the Gigant was modified into a 6-engined transport aircraft. By 1940, the Luftwaffe were engaged in the Blitz of Great Britain. In addition to fighters and ground fire, a number of aircraft had fallen foul of the cables on the barrage balloons which hung over British cities. In a hazardous set of experiments, Hanna Reitsch flew a Dornier 17 bomber, equipped with a cutter bar, straight into balloon cables, attempting to sever them. On one such flight, she was almost killed when the balloon cable smashed one of the aircraft's engines. For undertaking this highly dangerous work, Hanna Reitsch was awarded the Iron Cross, second class, and elevated to the status of a superstar within Nazi Germany. But more importantly, as far as Hanna was concerned, was that she now had direct access to the very upper levels of the Nazi hierarchy, including Hitler himself. When Hanna wanted something, she now had powerful allies to help her get it. Throughout World War II, Germany continued its development of leading-edge aviation projects. Foremost among those projects was the Messerschmitt Me-163 rocket plane. Its power plant allowed the Me-163 an astonishing rate of climb, and, by being towed to altitude, test pilot Heini Dittmar was able to reach a speed of over 600 miles per hour, a record which would only be exceeded when the sound barrier was broken in 1947. For Hanna, the Me-163 was one of the highlights of her flying career.
I can only tell you it was fascinating. It was like thundering through the skies, sitting on a cannonball, like being intoxicated by speed. It was not difficult to fly it. It was only an overwhelming impression. At the end of the airfield, or the airfield boundary, you already reached about 500 miles per hour, and with constant speed, you were climbing up in 1.5 to 2 minutes into a height of 30,000 feet.
While the Me-163's performance was impressive, its endurance was extremely limited. After 6 minutes, its fuel was exhausted, and the aircraft became a high-speed glider, returning to the airfield for an extremely demanding, unpowered landing. On her fifth flight, in the ME-163B, Hanna ran into serious difficulties. As the aircraft took off behind a tow plane for a glide test, the undercarriage failed to jettison. Fortunately, the aircraft carried none of its highly volatile fuel, but with the undercarriage still attached, the increased drag made the aircraft virtually unflyable.
I had to come to approach the airfield in a greater height as normally in order to be sure that you will reach the place, and you had then to lose high with a cautious side slip, but this destroyed the whole airflow because it was only wing without tail plane. It came out of control and crashed in the field and was completely demolished, and my head came to an instrument, and I suffered. My nose was, I have an artificial nose, and it's quadruple of fractured head and vertebra broken and many things. So after having been 5 months hospitalized, I was well again, spurred on by the only burning wish to continue as test pilot again.
The injuries sustained in the ME-163 crash earned Hanna an Iron Cross First Class to accompany her Iron Cross Second Class.
Hanna?
The 1965 film Operation Crossbow portrays an heroic Hanna Reitsch testing an uncontrollable V-1 flying bomb.
Luft an.
Wo ist der Fehler?
Der Fehler ist in der Zelle.
Hanna Reitsch really did fly a manned version of the V-1, but the reasons for that development program were even more sinister than those portrayed in Operation Crossbow. By 1943, it was obvious that the war was going badly for Germany. By now, the Americans had joined forces with the British, and the bombing of German cities continued, day and night. Hanna decided desperate measures were needed, and presented an outrageous proposal directly to Adolf Hitler. The V-1 was a deadly weapon, but its primitive guidance system could only take it to within a few miles of its intended aiming point. What Hanna was proposing was a manned version in which a pilot would fly the weapon directly into a strategic target. A suicide bomb.
We saw how our country bled itself to death slowly, how one city after the other became the victim of bombs. Death had a horrible harvest among the people. We believed that Germany could only be saved from its disastrous situation if a better basis for a fast ending of the war could be negotiated. To achieve this, the major strongholds of the enemy and the center of his resistance would have to be destroyed in quick successive blows.
Ultimately, the V-1 never was used as a suicide weapon, although test flights were conducted, launching it from beneath the wing of a Heinkel 111 bomber. Unlike a number of her colleagues, Hanna escaped serious injury in the numerous accidents involved in the development program. Pre-war language student Eric Brown became a test pilot at Farnborough and interrogated Hanna Reitsch at the end of World War II. Knowing her as he did, he has no doubts as to whether or not she would have made the supreme sacrifice.
If you ask yourself the interesting question, would Hanna himself been prepared to lead the way? I think without any doubt she would. She was that sort of person. I don't think she'd have hesitated for the fatherland and the great cause.
Hanna's patron, General Udet, had committed suicide in 1941. Since that time, Hanna had formed a close alliance with another senior German officer, General Ritter von Grimm. As Russian troops began their final assault on Berlin, Hitler summoned von Grimm to a meeting with him in the bunker. Hanna insisted on accompanying him. As von Grimm flew over the Russian positions, ground fire smashed through the Fiesler Storch aircraft, badly injuring him and rendering him unconscious. Reaching over von Grimm's inert body to the controls, Hanna landed the aircraft near the Brandenburg Gate from the rear seat of the cockpit. In Hitler's underground bunker, von Grimm was placed in charge of the now virtually non-existent Luftwaffe and ordered to rally his forces to one final effort. Hanna Reitsch offered to fly Magda Goebbels' children to safety, but she refused and later killed both her children and herself. Shortly before leaving the bunker on their futile mission, Hitler gave both Hanna and von Grimm cyanide tablets to use if the necessity arose. Days later, Adolf Hitler was dead, and Germany surrendered to the invading forces. Hanna had taken comfort from the knowledge that most of her family were living safely as refugees in Salzburg. She was devastated to learn from Ritter von Grimm that all of them were dead. In the immediate post-war confusion, a rumour had circulated that German citizens were to be repatriated to their place of origin. For the Reitsch family, this meant returning to Russian-occupied Silesia. As their forces had advanced, the Soviets had taken a terrible retribution for the atrocities committed by German forces in Russia. Hanna's father was determined not to allow his family to suffer the fate of so many other Germans under Soviet occupation. Following an unsuccessful attempt at poisoning, he shot his daughter Heidi, her 3 children, his wife and maid, and finally turned the gun upon himself. Subsequently, Hanna's misery was compounded when her good friend Ritter von Grimm used the cyanide tablet given to him by Hitler, rather than be tried as a war criminal at Nuremberg. For 15 months, Hanna was detained, pending investigation of her wartime activities. During that time, Captain Eric Brown was allowed to interrogate her on behalf of the British. He was disappointed with her level of technical knowledge about the projects she had been involved with, but he had no doubts about her political beliefs.
I talked to her about the technical aspect, and in some ways it was disappointing because she wasn't really technically minded in the strictest sense. And I realised that what she had done in her flight testing career was largely spectacular stuff, which was great propaganda news, but hadn't contributed a lot to the major aspects of operational aircraft development. Anyway, she was in a very emotional state at that stage, and she blurted out a lot about her time in the bunker. She was absolutely obsessed with Hitler. You see, Hanna couldn't be persuaded that the Nazis were involved in the Holocaust or anything like this. How she could live in the circles in which she lived and really ask us to believe that she had no knowledge of this is, to my mind, utter nonsense. And in my view, she was a total fanatical Nazi.
Captain Robert Work, the American Chief of Air Force Intelligence, took a different view, and even suggested that Hanna might be of some use in the rehabilitation of post-war Germany. In the years following the war, Hanna rediscovered her love of gliding. She was instrumental in promoting the sport in India, and under the patronage of President Nkrumah, assisted in establishing gliding schools in Ghana. And in 1960, Hanna was introduced to President Kennedy as a founder member of the Whirly Girls, a group of female helicopter pilots. While she was feted around the world, many in Germany still regarded her as an embarrassment. Hanna Reitsch died in 1979 at the age of 67, only months after breaking another world gliding record. Until the end of her life, she continued to wear her iron crosses with pride and remained unrepentant about her role in the development of Hitler's war machine and her close involvement with the Nazi regime. As with her life, Hanna's death was surrounded by controversy. Many believe that she finally used the cyanide tablet given to her by Adolf Hitler 34 years before. So, was Hanna Reitsch a fanatical Nazi who was fully aware of the atrocities being committed by her country and cynically chose to ignore them in pursuit of her own goals? Or was she simply a naive patriot whose sense of honour and duty allowed her to be manipulated by an evil regime for its own ends? These issues continue to be contentious, but her love of flying and her exceptional abilities in that field are beyond dispute. So, where does she stand in the pantheon of great female aviation pioneers? The final word from test pilot Captain Eric Brown.
In my experience, and I've met a lot of the very famous women pilots, I think she was the greatest woman pilot that has lived to date. She covered a wider spectrum than most of these other women like Amelia Earhart, Amy Johnson, Jacqueline Cochran, etc. cover. Far wider aspect. And there's no doubt about it, she was one of the greatest glider pilots of all time. So she is supreme, I think, in the women's list.